Hi class, in this video we're going to go over remote access using VPN. Sorry my voice is a little hoarse because I'm kind of getting over a cold. So I updated my diagram. I've included this laptop, which is going to be our VPN client. Um, I've changed this to include an NPS server, which is a network policy server. It's also a radius server. uh, this NPS is Microsoft's term, but in reality, it's a radius server. It can do other things than just radius, but it includes the radius protocol. Radius stands for Remote Access Dial-in User Service. And this is the same laptop as over here. So once everything is done and configured, the client out on the internet will be able to connect to our VPN server, and it'll appear as if the client is in our private network. It'll have an IP appropriate for our private network, and all the packets that um, traverse the internet will be encapsulated with encryption. So if anyone tries to read these packets en route, they won't be able to do anything with them because they're all being encrypted. And VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. Nowadays, this is becoming, especially with Corona, this is kind of common knowledge what a VPN server does. But so in this lab, what we're going to do is set it up. So I have everything booted up in my network at this point. All my times are correct. Also, I just want to point out something else. Last time we had our live session, someone pointed out that this shutdown button was added. So I sent in a request to the guy who maintains this. I'm going back to lab. And he's going to put a button here saying shut down all. So we can hit one button to shut down all of our machines. So the first thing we're going to do is connect to our NAT router. Right now it's just configured as a NAT router. So what we're going to do is reconfigure it as a NAT and a VPN server. So I'm going to sign in as a local administrator. This machine, because it touches the internet, is not joined to the domain. I'm going to go to Tools and Routing and Remote Access. Now while that's opening up, I'm going to go back to our diagram. This I'm just putting here to demonstrate what we're doing. We don't actually have this set up and we won't have this. So we're just going to configure the VPN server and the NPS server. You're just going to have to imagine that we're going to test it with a laptop, which we don't have part of our network. So I'm not really going to configure this, and I'm not going to configure this. So I'm back on my NAT router. I'm going to right click. I'm going to disable routing remote access. Because when we configured it the first time, we configured it as NAT only. So I'm going to right click it now and configure enable. Last time we did NAT. This time we're going to do NAT and VPN. It's asking us where do we get our internet connection from? In our case, it's saying select the interface that connects this server to the internet. That's going to be our public interface. It's asking us, where do we want to put our clients? You could put them here in your DMZ. You could put them in your private network. In my case, I'm just going to put them in a private network. And how do we want to give IP addresses to our clients? So when this machine connects, it's going to have an IP that it gets from the Starbucks or its home internet service. And then as it traverses the internet, it'll get a public IP. When we connect it into our private network, we need to give it a 172.16 address. So we could literally configure all those IP addresses in here, or we could just get all the IP addresses from our DHCP server. And I'll show you what happens as soon as I'm done with this wizard. Click next. Now, you don't realize this, but it's actually started the NAT portion of the wizard. The first portion, the first few questions we've answered were for the VPN. So now this is the NAT. So it's asking, when packets traverse this NAT router and go out to the internet, do we want to do the translation on the private network or the DMZ? In our case, we want to do both. But the wizard only allows us to do one at a time. So we're going to do the private, and then we're going to come back through and add the DMZ. So we're going to choose private initially, and then we'll add the DMZ once we get in. Now, are we going to use a radius server? Yes, we're going to use a radius server, which we haven't configured, which will be on DC1. This radius server is going to handle authentication. This machine is not joined to our domain, so it has no clue about any of the user accounts that exist in our private network. And we might have multiple VPN servers, and we don't want to have to set up user accounts on every VPN. So what we're going to do is not have the VPN server handle authentication. We're just going to pass that off to the MPS radius server. So every time a client connects, the VPN server will say, do I allow this person in? Pass all the user credentials to this radius server. This radius server will examine the user credentials, see if that user is allowed in, then give it either a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And then the VPN server will handle the actual connection. So this is a radius server, and the VPN client, excuse me, this is a radius server. The radius server is this actual VPN server. So this is the radius server, this is the radius client. This is the VPN server, this is the VPN client. VPN client, VPN server. The client will never talk to the radius server directly. So VPN client, VPN server. Radius client, radius server. So the radius client is the VPN server. So yes, we're going to set up a radius server. The radius server will be on 172.16.0.2, and the password, I'm using our standard password, capital PA11WORD. You don't want to allow any VPN server to connect to our radius server. So unless they have that pre-shared key, our radius server won't talk to them. Then finish. I'll explain the DHCP in a moment. Okay, first thing we need to do is on our NAT router, we need to add the other private network, the DMZ. We want to allow these people to get to the internet as well. Any machine on the DMZ we want to translate out. The wizard wouldn't allow us to add it. The next thing we need to do is go to public, go to properties. Because we have multiple IP address, public IP addresses, we need to set up an address pool. And those IP addresses are 2 to 8. These are all our public IPs. If we have multiple public IPs and we don't set up an address pool, at that point, NAT won't work. You don't need to do this if you only have one public IP. I didn't mean to do that. You don't need to do this if you only have one public IP, but if you have multiple public IPs, you have to set up your address pool. So I'm going to click OK. Then I want to go over and show you what happened with the DHCP server. So I'm going to sign in. I'm going to open up DHCP. I'm not sure why it's doing that. I'm just going to restart the DHCP service. So I'm going to go down to leases. And I can see that I have one machine that grabbed a whole bunch of IP addresses, 10 of them. It grabbed 10 addresses. So basically what happened is when this client connects to my VPN server, I need to give it an IP address appropriate for this subnet. The problem is the client can't connect until it gets an IP, and it can't get an IP until it connects. So what happens is when the VPN client connects to the VPN server, the VPN server has contacted the DHCP and has grabbed 10 IP addresses at a time. Every time someone connects, it will have those 10 addresses cached. And every time someone connects, it'll assign one IP to the uh, VPN client and one IP to its own interface. So what it's going to do is it's going to, if I have 5 clients connected, it'll add 5 more addresses to it to the NAT router itself, and each client will have one of those other 5. So every time I have 10 IP addresses, that will handle 5 connections. I need one IP for the NAT and one IP for the laptop, and between those 2 IPs will be my tunnel. That's what I'm creating. They call it a tunnel because it encapsulates all of the packets. So every time I connect, I use 2 IPs, one for the NAT, one for the laptop. So this machine might have 40 additional IPs if it has 40 clients connected. So every time it runs out of IPs, the VPN server will contact the DHCP server and get 10 more addresses. So I'm going to go back to my NAT router. So there's those 10 addresses that I grabbed. So if I right click IPv4. Sorry, if I right click my NAT router and go to properties, under IPv4, I can see that I'm going to use the DHCP server to grab IP addresses, and then I'm going to connect. I'm going to try to get IPs appropriate for this private subnet. Because remember, I could have put the clients here or here. So when this machine gets IPs, it needs to request them on this interface so the DHCP server knows to give them from this scope or this subnet. That's all because this is set to the private network. When we did the wizard, that's what it did. Now I'm going to go to ports. I'm going to go to properties. Every time someone connects, they're going to use a certain tunneling protocol. And there's a whole bunch of tunneling protocols. This is SSL in a tunneling protocol. You're using SSL certificates in a tunneling protocol to secure their traffic. This is Internet Key Exchange version 2. Use that to protect the traffic. Cisco's L2 certificate protocol plus a tunneling protocol to encrypt that traffic. These are the 4 tunneling protocols that this supports. I'm going to be doing PPP over a tunneling protocol, which is PPTP, point-to-point tunneling protocol. So I'm going to click on configure. This is the only one I want to keep. I want to get rid of these others because they're just taking up resources. So I can go here and just, since I know I'm not going to be dealing with that, just drop them down to 0. So right now, this is going to support 5 connections. This is not a tunneling protocol, and this is not a tunneling protocol. You're not going to mess with those. Just these 4 are tunneling protocols. The only one we're going to be dealing with is point-to-point tunneling protocol. And now you can see it reduced it only to those protocols. So right now, our VPN server is set up. What we need to do now is configure our NPS server. And I click on security. I can see we're using Radius to authenticate and Radius to document who's connecting. If I was using SSLTP or SSTP SSL certificates over a tunneling protocol, I would configure that right here, but we don't have a certificate server in our network yet. That's in the next class. So everything's configured on this box. Now we're going to go over to our DC1. We're going to sign in and configure this as a Radius server. In real life, most likely this box won't be a Microsoft box. This box is going to be some sort of like Sonic Wall. That's probably the most popular VPN vendor out there. But there's a whole bunch out there, but you know, rarely do I think companies are using Microsoft VPN servers. But I'm showing you with Microsoft because this is a Microsoft class. So I'm waiting for the blue bar to stop. So I'm going to go to Manage, Add Roles and Features. It's going to be a role on this machine. And I'm going to install Network Policy and Access Services. This doesn't have to be installed on a DC, but it's really flaky if you don't. So I always like to put this machine, this service on one DC, possibly 2. Now I'm just going to walk through the wizard. and restart if needed. I'm going to pause this while it's installing. Okay, it's installed, so I'm going to close this out. Go to Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers. Now I could have, which is not very efficient, go to each user that I wanted to connect, to allow to connect. I could right click their user account, go to dial-in properties, and allow them to connect. But that's very time consuming. That's what we're going to do with our MPS server. We're going to control access through our MPS server. So instead of allowing each individual user, we're just going to control it through a policy. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new group. What we're going to do is create a new group. I'm going to call it VPN users. Then for every user you want to allow to connect, you would put them in that group. So you would right click, add to group, and you type in VPN users. So that user was just added to that group. Go to properties, member of, and you can see that that user is now part of that group. So if you had 30 users, you would add all your users to that group. So now that you have the group created and it's populated with users, now we're going to configure the MPS. So I'm going to go to Tools, Network Policy Server. Now, I said earlier that this service can do a bunch of different things, like it could do health checks. Let's say someone brings in a laptop into our network. We could configure this NPS server to not allow that laptop to connect unless they were fully patched or had antivirus software running and stuff like that. So it can do a lot more than just radius, but we're going to do um, just radius today. So I'm going to expand radius clients and servers. Then I said earlier, this machine is our radius client. This is our radius server. So I need to tell the radius server to talk to this machine, to allow this machine to send requests to the radius server. So I'm back on my DC1. I'm going to create a new, and I don't care what you call it. This has multiple IPs, some public IPs, one IP in the DMZ, and one IP in the private network. When you supply an IP, always supply the IP that's closest to the radius server. So this will be 172.16.0.1. I'm going to use a pre-share key. So without this, our radius server would never even entertain requests from the VPN server. So that's the first step. Now we're actually going to create a policy. This top one is for when someone wants to connect a laptop or something like that for like health reasons and stuff, to make sure that the laptop is secure. But what we're going to do is a network connection policy. So you can have hundreds of policies here. And the first one that the client matches is the policy it will accept. If it doesn't match any policy, it'll just allow the client to connect. So Microsoft has two policies here by default that will match any client. So we want to make sure that you never delete these, because if you delete these two policies and your client that's connecting doesn't match one of yours, it'll allow them in. So you never want to delete these two policies. These are catch-alls that will prevent clients from logging in. And they're only going to reach these policies if your policy doesn't match that client. So I'm going to create a new network policy. And I'm going to call this VPN Connections. And it is going to be a VPN server. If you're using the NPS server with a third-party VPN server, you can specify that vendor if you know the vendor's ID. We're going to allow people to connect to our network if they meet two conditions. So I'm going to add the first condition. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom. NAS port type. If there are connecting through a VPN protocol, some sort of tunneling protocol, and so I'm going to click add again. I have three types of groups. A user group contains only user accounts. A machine group that contains only computer accounts. Or a Windows group that contains both users and computers. We're just going to do, a user group. And we're going to add VPN users. So for someone to connect to us, they have to be a member of this group and they have to be connecting to us through a VPN protocol. Now we can add a whole bunch of other restrictions. We can say you can only allow, it has to be a certain time of the day. They only could be using a certain authentication type. There's all kinds of things that we can do. We can do caller ID, which basically means they're going to connect to us and we're going to disconnect immediately and connect back to them. If they're doing it with a dial-up service. So if they're not at that phone number, they won't be able to connect. Or we can say that they have to be using a certain IP address. We know what their IP address is at home, and then at that point they must be calling from that IP. So there's a whole bunch of restrictions. I'm just giving you two. For us to allow you to connect to our network, you have to be a member of that group and you have to be using a tunneling protocol. And if you meet those two conditions, we're going to grant access. And we want you to authenticate with Enhanced Authentication Protocol Microsoft Chat version 2. I'm choosing this because I know Windows 10 client supports it. By default, that's the default one. So you would use whatever authentication method that your organization supports. They could support smart cards or tokens or something like that. We're just using Microsoft EAP MS Chat version 2. It's more secure than these two down here. By default, Windows 10, that's the first authentication method that it tries when it connects through for VPN. Then we can offer constraints. If they're idle for 10 minutes, disconnect them. Maybe we only want to allow people to connect 20 minutes at a time. We could do the caller ID station to make sure that they're calling from a certain IP. Maybe you don't want to allow people in after hours. Maybe you want to dictate what protocol they're using. And some other attributes you can set up if they have multiple internet connections. Like let's say they have two internet connections at where they're currently located. You allow them to join those two internet connections together to increase their bandwidth. You could set up some IP filtering to for better encryption. What type of encryption you want to use. you can dictate what IP they get, but we're just going to use our um, DHCP server to give them one IP. Again, what type of protocol are we going to connect? Vendor specific stuff for certain radius servers. We're not going to, excuse me, radius clients, which is our VPN server. So let's say you're going to use a Sonic Wall VPN server. Well, it's also a Sonic Wall VPN client. Excuse me, it's also a Sonic Wall radius client. And finish. Okay, now that's the whole VPN server. Now, guys in class, I would have had you set up this and test the server. But I'm just going to show you one thing we can't really test. But let's say we did have a Windows 10 client. We would go here, we would open up on the Windows 10 client, this connection, and then we would go to VPN. Okay, I don't like this. I'm going to back to the old school method. I'm going to go, it's frozen. Give me 1 second. Okay, it's not working. So let me try it again. I'm going to the old school method of doing it. Network and sharing center. Set up a new connection. This is the old way of doing it. I'm not sure why the new way isn't working. Oh, now it's working. So I'm going to click on add a VPN connection. Provider is Windows. The connection name is my work. Then you're going to put in your public IP, which in my case would be .8. And we're just going to leave everything alone for right now. Oh, no, they want to. I don't know why they're insistent. Oh, I didn't choose it. Sorry. So I'm going to click save. Once I have it saved, I need to do some changes. I will go to Network Sharing Center, go to your adapter, then right click the VPN connection. Go to Properties. Under Security, we want to choose PPTP. We don't want to allow it to try each protocol. We know what protocol we want. If we just left it alone, it would try this protocol, this protocol, this protocol. This is the last one it tries. Just to speed up the connection, I would do this on my Windows 10 client. And then for use extendable authentication protocol, EAP chat version 2, we would want this setting right here. Then once you've done that, you'd be able to go here, click on my work, and connect. It's not going to work now because I'm trying to connect from the inside, but I can try. I don't really have a client out in the internet, so it'll never connect. So I'm trying to connect from here. It's not going to work. But this will give you an idea how to set up the client. So don't worry about actually connecting. Um, I don't even really want this here, so I'm just going to delete it. But I just wanted to show you how to set up the VPN client. It's not that difficult. Every time I get on Windows 10, they've updated the process, so you might have to play around with it if you're using, 1706 version of Windows 10 versus 1809 or something like that. It keeps changing. So try to right click here, go here and see where you can find it. In my case, it was right here, and it didn't come up right away, but just play around with it. So we've set up our VPN server, and we also set up our NPS server. Okay, that's it for this video. I will uh, set up the direct access server in the next video. Thank you.